Good evening and welcome to the Joko. Welcome forward with us. I am Brother Youssef, a member of the Joko, a local poet here in the what's known as the Los Angeles Basin, the city of Los Angeles. I'm a local professor, a professor of composition and literature, creative writing, and I am joined by my partner and comrade, Tasha. Hi, Tasha.
Hi, Yusuf. Greetings, everyone. And as we always do, we always want to begin with our acknowledgement of our lineages, our acknowledgments, right? Um, as some people use any kinds of words for these kinds of opening gestures, but by which we mean to orient, our ourselves for doing the program and have the right thoughts come through and the right questions emerge. And so we look at our personal lineages and acknowledge our personal lineages that have made us into people who are concerned with the uplift of the planet, with the preservation and flourishing, thriving, happiness, health of humanity, um, as people who are uh, embracing and accept the charge of liberating the African human family and claim identity with that African human family as we bring into our thinking and our memory all of the superheroes of the African family. Um, Names we know and names we don't know, through whose work the African family and the world, and sometimes the African family and thus the world, have been progressively relieved of the uh, made some inroads to the relief from the pressures and abuses and injuries of this era of European world domination in the mode and through the instrumentality of white supremacy, and extraction, capitalist extraction. And we recognize and look at, remember that we have resisted not only, what is the word, courageously, but successfully. Okay. Resistance is successful. And we look at those models, we make ourselves students of those models. We always bring to the forefront that any work we do for the liberation of the African family, for the liberation of humanity, for the liberation of living things, we do at the hospitality of the ancestors of this particular land, in this LA basin, this Tongva land, um, land of the Tongva people, I should say. They're unceded lands, and we do acknowledge that it's by their hospitality and the hospitality of their ancestors that we are able to live, move, and have our being. Um, and yes, we always like to start there. I always like to
Yes.
start there. And We're talking tonight about some specifics. Opened this conversation about um, the right wing and culture, right? The connection with culture, um, the control of culture. Like culture, last week we established that really is kind of the, and I believe I am quoting Yusuf properly in calling it the meaning environment. Okay, or at least that's a phraseology that I like, that
Mhm,
particularly appeals to me, right? So
mhm,
it is the very soup we frogs are swimming in, and or the very pond, right? It's the water of the pond,
mhm,
and so our meanings um, are set of interwoven symbols and behaviors and activities and all of its intricacy is this thing called culture, right? And it's something that is constantly reinforced and reproduced not only through our behaviors and through our through our
mhm,
own uh, through ourselves as mediating agents of culture, but
mhm.
definitely through the implements of media as institutions, right? And so tonight we're going to look at, right, looking at uh, information institutions of various kinds, whether they are educational institutions, uh, media institutions. Um, Tonight we're going to be talking about some arts institutions and the specific um, how specifically arts and culture um, responds to and is interwoven with. I believe the title is Reaction, Reform, and Revolution. And so, that being said, Brother Yusuf, where would you like to start this conversation?
We could. There's so many places to start. I guess the place to start is one of the tributaries we explored last week, and that's it. Culture, or again, what we generally mean by culture, which often folks mean the arts. The But then those other, the even those other aspects, right, of the cultural, like cuisine, and what attire is. All these are material goods, so to speak, right? And certainly in the political economy of capitalism, they're commodified, right? They're all commodities, right? And I know it's there's the interesting things in the arts, right? The actor, the singer, um, is both the worker and the product in a way, right? The way in which their body um, is the instrument, right, that they wield. Very much like athletes, which also exist in the cultural realm, right? The athletic, right? These sports, um, which we can think of, right, as its own industry, and certainly is, right? The sports industry globally. Um, but then so much of what people experience as sports, either amateur or professional, right, in the contemporary world, is through media, right? It's mediated through television or streaming services or radio, etc. Right? Most fans of any given team in some city somewhere um, is not going to the stadium on a daily basis, right? But following them through media, some form of media. And so the the cultural product, the various kinds of cultural product are, it's completely interdependent with, all other areas of production, right? Um, in the modern world. And certainly people are doing things, well, I thought in the moment, I thought of assemblage artists, right? Who are, um, picking up the debris of modern life and creating things with it, right? But even there, right, they're dependent on the productive on the productive forces that produces all of this waste, right?
Mhm.
All of this trash to go through, right? To repurpose, to reuse. Um, so that, I mean, just starting there, I guess, then, right? Uh, the way in which we have been encouraged in the United States, right? And at least, right, in the United States, for sure, to think of culture, the arts, as this separate area, um, without always thinking about how it's connected to every other sector of society. Um, Unless and until, right, something becomes controversial. And now the strikes of workers in the arts, out here in, well, and I know it wasn't just here because folks work everywhere.
Mhm.
But the writers' strike of, was that a year ago now, a
Mhm.
year and a half?
Mhm.
Was there reason? Was I can't remember now. Was an actor strike along with that, or
Yeah, I
uh,
believe so.
I
Yeah.
think so, right? And then the animation workers, right, who are,
Mhm.
for all I know, I think I may still be on strike, right? I don't recall reading about, um, an agreement, or hearing about one. So those things, right? When the workers strike, uh, we're reminded, right? We're reminded of how, those that work, right, and that
Mhm.
product
Mhm.
is, as much a part of
Mhm.
everything in some ways. And we have said this about Donald Trump before. Whatever else about him, and there's a lot about him that, everything we've been talking about, these last several weeks, that since created Trump or made him possible, a seed at the ground for a Trump era. If anything else, though, he has sharpened the contradictions, right, for a lot of people. And so now this, again, kind of, what does this even mean? Um, Tariff on foreign films. At least, so now people have to talk about how film is
Yes.
completely intertwined into the global economy, right? As
Mhm.
I've heard some commentators say, well, how do you
Mhm.
even define an American film, right?
Mhm.
When post production is done in a lot of different places,
Mm.
um,
Mhm. Mhm.
film, does that mean it's filmed here, etc., right? Or
Mhm.
is the
Mhm.
is the corporation, whatever corporation owns
Mhm.
the studio.
Mhm.
Sony is a Japanese corporation, isn't it?
Mhm.
Um, Etc., right?
Mhm.
So what does that even mean, right?
Mhm.
But if it doesn't
Mm.
do anything else, right? At least people have to talk about, well, what
Mhm.
does that mean? And as I heard
Mhm.
somebody, say the other day, local California, um, maybe a professor, I'm not sure, maybe somebody in the industry. Yeah, if you really wanted to do something, then you would create something like, a U.S. film, um, council, like there's an Australian film council, and how other countries do to support the industry. But of course, that's the last thing they want to do because the goal is to privatize everything, and that's never been the Hollywood model, right? Even though, well, yeah, that's never been the Hollywood model. The a national institute for film, or a national council, and that kind of support. And I don't know about
Mhm.
federal funding, may be
Mhm.
available for certain grants or whatever, but the
Mhm.
studios, the Hollywood system,
Mhm.
as such, and certainly, they get permission and whatnot to borrow military equipment, and there are always military advisors and intelligence advisors around for those films, right? And
Mhm.
folks who are have to sign
Mhm.
off on the script,
Mhm.
if you want what they got, basically, or you
Mhm.
do without it.
Mhm.
So that, right,
Mhm.
always remembering that about all of these culture industries, and
Mhm.
um, we're it's primarily a visual culture, so we
Mhm.
generally think in terms of movies, television,
Mhm.
streaming services, things
Mhm.
that we primarily watch.
Mhm.
But yeah, just as you indicated, it's still the literary world, such as it exists, including certainly including magazines, um,
Mhm.
textbooks, right? That
Mhm.
other area, education,
Mhm.
um, certainly includes the sports world, the culinary world. Yeah, as we have often remarked, watching some of the cooking competitions, uh,
Mhm.
the sort of preparation, the way, preparation to serve the elite type of thing, and but all those areas, right, um,
Mhm.
are completely entwined with, dependent on expressions of, right, the modern political economy of this late capitalism, that particularly in the United States, where and maybe this is the case also in the in other parts of the global north, where there's next to no manufacturing. Most of the local economy is service, right? People getting in various types of service industries. So anyway.
Mhm. Mhm. As a few beats back, as you were talking about that, the way we tend to collectively define certain things and the notion of uh, art, right, as a separate realm,
Mhm,
any of these things as separate realms, right? Arts, politics, uh, health, nature, whatever
mhm,
realm you want to name, right? That sense though of um, discrete areas rather than interdependent things is also actually something that uh, our television culture, our entertainment, our particular modality of entertainment culture cultivates. You
mm,
know,
mhm,
has cultivated, which is to say that it could just as easily have be not some, not
mhm,
cultivate
mhm,
that kind of incorrect, you know, um, oversimplified and hence stupefying sense of how things work,
mhm,
even before saying view of the world view,
mhm,
a sense of how things work, and this very a real difficulty um, that I think it would probably be fair to say that we generally have as Americans, and I think it's something that we see, in anyone who has tried to do education and instruction from certain kinds of critical perspectives as of late, as of late, find it quite difficult to communicate speak in terms of abstracts, to speak conceptually, to what I'm saying, get beyond kind of this very concrete uh discussion of things, um of whatever the topic is, never mind the the cultivated disconnect of young people from the educational process. I mean, from the educational process, from institutions of education, what have you. Um, just in terms of how uh, we think about information, how we think about the world and the so-called world of ideas. So anyway,
Mhm, mhm,
all of that is to kind of refer to and highlight the the which we'll talk about more definitely as we go on in this chat, um, how this television culture has served to really uh, maybe the right term is parochialize. That's probably one of the right terms, but really serve to uh, curtail, limit, really reduce the space within which we have to think about, discuss, what have you, kind of in our everyday goings on. If the in that whole concept of the popular program,
mhm, mhm,
that is
and,
manipulated as much as if not
yeah,
more than being a spontaneous kind of a thing.
mhm,
Oh, give the people what they like. This is what the people like.
mhm. In
But anyway,
that sense of, the way in which, those kinds of popular TV shows are, shape are used to shape public opinion, as you say, limit and particularly limit the political imagination. Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yes,
um,
the economic imagination, the cultural
yeah,
imagination, the all of
mhm,
these imaginations, limiting the
mhm.
imagination. Excuse me, go ahead. That just
Well, I'm wondering, yeah, as I have no idea. It's interesting that I have no idea if a socialist TV writer um,
mm,
ever brought. I mean, what do you bring right to the producer, right? Except certainly, right? Socialist writers have gotten their material on air, right? And of course, just like,
mhm,
well, I mean, you're
mhm,
just telling the story about how people live, right?
mhm,
Um, maybe whatever solutions there are, maybe that's television we never got to see because, of course, television becomes really popular in the United States, or begins to become kind of generalized, right? Um, during during and after the McCarthy era, right? And the Red Scare and the Red Channels and all that, right? So some of the uh, uh,
mm,
progressive folks and that whole range of one didn't necessarily have to be red, to be in red channels, right? If you were just an advocate of civil rights, you could have gotten in red channels. And this is, like this
mhm,
very much the case of Hazel Scott, right? Who outspoken, black woman, just talented beyond
mhm,
compare, and who had a television show. I
mm,
think in the late 40s, maybe into the early 50s, um, and then was added to red channels. But she had all, through her
mm,
career, made refused to be treated as a second class citizen, and
mhm,
um, or the people around her, right?
mhm,
She did not,
mhm,
yeah, so she was outspoken, right, and an
mhm,
advocate of civil rights, and married to Adam Clayton Powell. Um,
mhm,
so anyway,
mhm,
she so, let me that was just an aside, right? So, but and as an example of someone who was not a socialist, right?
mhm,
Certainly
mhm,
liberal, right? Progressive,
mhm,
but not a socialist. But that's enough, right, to be in the red channels. So
mhm,
it's interesting that, yeah, there is this period, right, that you're getting things, or leftist, progressive writers, producers, directors, actors, they can get work done. Um, Particularly the writers, right? Because they can write under. assumed names and all. Um, so there are things that can make it to television that can challenge fascism openly, but not necessarily capitalism as such, right? That
Mhm.
can be can even express anti-nuclear, right,
Mhm.
concerns.
Mhm.
I think we saw, you see that in the Twilight Zone.
Mhm.
Um, and Twilight Zone is, also plenty of anti-communist type,
Mhm.
like the classic,
Mhm.
what is it? To serve man.
Mhm.
That's all anti-communist allegory, right?
Mhm.
Right there. That's all anti-communist allegory. Classic episode, right? But the ways in which the acceptable ideology, right,
Mhm.
is allowed to go forth. So
Mhm.
how many? I mean, and yeah, we live in LA, right, and we know that in many ways, in really important ways, even still, right. This is a company town. It's hard not to know somebody connected to the industry directly in some kind of way, right? Like you know what 1 degree removed from you, if you yourself aren't a member of the industry, right, you got a family
Mhm.
member who has
Right.
worked catering,
Right.
doing hair,
Right.
writing,
Someone's in the industry.
being
Some
a driver. I mean,
the industry.
all the
Right.
various
An
things, right?
extra. Being
An
an
extra.
extra.
I mean, how many people make extra money by,
Right.
damn, I'm gonna go be an extra. I'll go
Right.
be an extra, right? So we know how this, yeah, how this is a company town, right? So,
Yes.
anyway, what I was going to get to is, so we know, you can have an idea of how many shows and or movies are pitched, and then what's going to get
Mhm.
greenlit.
Mhm.
So so move away from movies for a minute, just for television, right? They have
Mhm.
no idea what's going to be popular, right?
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
it is a crapshoot, right? But so all the new pilots, and I can remember, this doesn't seem to be as big a deal anymore. But I can remember how the school year starting and the new season of television was going to start, and you'd get the preview shows of the new shows coming, and all um and most of those shows wouldn't make it, right? Most of those shows wouldn't make it. And who knew what was going to be popular? And if a show can get a 3-year run, I mean, that's kind of fantastic if a show can get a 3-year run, let alone, because most the ones who
Yeah.
do make it might only last a year, right? So they could never know what's going to be popular. They can only guess at best. Um, but we have no idea what stories didn't get greenlit to even be able to make a pilot, right? That
Yeah. So
somebody.
there's this way in which the mediated is always the curated, you know?
Mhm.
There's a selection process. Someone
There
is
is a
making a
selection process.
choice, and it's not always about what is strictly, quote, unquote, "popular," you know?
Right.
It's, I think about, well,
Yep.
the one that
Well,
just happened to
for
come to
whom is it being curated?
Huh?
For whom is it being curated?
And for whom is it being
Because they
curated?
have a night that they have a notion
Right,
of their audience, right?
right,
And that
right,
audience, whether
right,
that notion is representative or not, right?
right, and
But
the
they're
whole
thinking
piece
about
of
whatever people mean by middle America, right?
and, like, in this yeah, the middle America, projection, and then what, I guess comes up in the '70s, what have you, the opening up in various areas, the quote unquote "black market," so there are more, images of Black people, Black stories, Black, and what have you. I don't have any actual reference to numbers or whatnot to see, well, if we take something like A Good Times, and I want to follow that train right there, but we'll get back to it. How universally popular a program a Good Times was. I don't think it was just Black people watching Good Times and enjoying Good Times. Or the Jeffersons, or these kinds of things, and different kinds, these different kinds of programs. And so there's this, definitely, the political element, but this, um, what was it that I was thinking about? Oh, what came to mind was the beginning of I think it may have been a pilot series or just an introductory series of Kindred that was on one of the streaming services. And I'm quite sure that was popular. One, Octavia Butler is popular, and it was a great program. I talked to a lot of people in the street about Kindred, and everybody was interested in where the story would go. And then, no, it's just not, and that's all that's available is this, something that ends at the first 8 episodes, or just these kinds of things.
So
But
it didn't get renewed.
I don't believe so. But you know
Mm-hmm.
what? I'm so not up on my streaming. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know all the different services, because it may have just been moved to a different streaming service, or some kind of different level of access that I don't have, and won't be buying. So, so I mean, that's possible. I don't think so, because neither have I seen any kind of
People
follow.
don't. I don't hear anybody talking about Kindred, and it's
Yeah.
certainly and other, you know, other medium or other media. I don't hear commentary on, or
Yeah.
reference to Kindred, right? So
Yeah.
I had forgotten that it was yeah, that there was a series.
Right. And even when you think of, and again, that industry, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, world, the industry world, and the curation in the industry in comparison to uh, a public service, into comparison to what you can access even on a PBS, the varied kinds of stories. Used to have a little formula for it. I don't remember what my little formula was, but in terms of just kind of pop TV, the world that it creates with its, uh, white majority, a few Black friends, one Asian, and the occasional Latino, no indigenous people. You know what I'm saying? Whereas in public, um, uh, a few token Asians of
Mm-hmm.
whatever that means.
It
Whereas
depends on where the show is set, right? Because if it's set in
absolutely,
Montana or Wyoming, then you might have the Native
then you'll see it
Americans,
right
not, but
floating.
not, right? So they'll move. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Right. But you
So
have access to,
or if it's in Hawaii, then there'll be some Native Hawaiian character. Yeah,
absolutely, but even just the exactly,
yeah.
exactly. The story that is told is uh well, maybe under the veil of commodifying and what will sell and all of that BS.
That
Um
what will
the
sell,
very a dearth
what will give it the local flavor.
there's a dearth of diversity. You don't
Mm-hmm.
see varied stories. So all of the Black presence, and Black stories that we see is, been a
Right. Well,
politically opportune
um,
piece. And then there's now more of a featuring of Latino stories. And so you
right.
have Latino here, and
Well,
so that
you go through cycles, right? Because um, the and Vantel Whitfield is quoted saying that just because black people are in it, just because a black person wrote it, that don't make it black. And that is
yes. Yes. So the
mostly
appearance.
what we see. Right?
There we go. Now that's a good segue into what we really wanted to part of what we really wanted to get into this evening, in terms of how the culture industries um, intertwine with reaction, reform, and revolution to reproduce, or what is the phraseology? Reproduce or interrupt, intervene in the status quo, right? But yeah, and I had this really, um, I asked you last week, and I've been needing you to talk about the that make some comments about the counter revolutionary programming, you know, um, in a post 60s era, in a post 60s era. Um, what did that look like? How was that counter revolution uh, story told?
Um, so there's an interview, and this is probably in the early '70s, right? That Bob Marley is giving on Jamaican radio, and the interviewer asked Bob, what do you think happened to that revolutionary spirit, right, of the '60s, right, or that, and Bob says, everybody got a job downtown,
Mm,
and
mhm,
that's a tactic, right, though, of power,
mm,
right, to co-opt,
mhm,
right, to peel off, a certain sector, an energetic sector, and to redefine what the goal is, right? To redefine freedom away from any notion of liberation and into assimilation, right? The struggle is always to become a part of, etc. Um, and that's what we see. And really, it begins. You can begin to see that in the early '60s in some shows, certain shows, because again,
mm,
in the wake of World War II, overt racism had more or less been discredited, right? Um, that kind of, yeah. Now, which doesn't make it go away right away, but
mhm,
coming out of work, you can't, you can't, be an overt racist and be taken seriously, right? In a particular way, right? The
mhm,
and so it's already right. You can begin to see, um, cracks, or really what I should say are kinds of accommodations being made. Um, Black faces, emerging on television, as television also is now becoming more widespread in the post-war era. Um, Television being marketed right as your now new home theater, and so these black faces coming into homes in this particular way. So you have the very popular musical shows, right? Hazel Scott, a person who, and I don't want to say she had her career destroyed by the McCarthy period and the Red Scare, though she was put in
mhm,
the red channels, and
mhm,
quote unquote blacklisted. Um,
mhm,
but she moved to France and had a great career. I
mhm,
mean, she moved to France and she had a great career. So
mhm,
um, the you had what's his name, Nat King Cole, right? Had a TV show. Um, and there's this very particular type of black presentation, um, certainly satisfying to those concerned with respectability politics, right? The And then you get that show, the migrating from radio to television,
mhm,
the Amos and Andy show.
mhm,
um, so migrating away from the white voice actors to now black actors. But it revives or brings to television what had always been
mhm,
the most popular form of entertainment
mhm.
in the United States
A minstrel show.
before the movies, right?
Mhm,
Before film,
mhm,
and
mhm,
which of course comes into film, right? Is preserved by film. Yeah, the minstrel show, right? Minstrelsy. And so you have these characters, you know, uh, doing minstrelsy without the blackface, right? That was even required of black actors in the early, or in in the history of entertainment, right? Live entertainment in this country. Um,
Mhm.
and of course, it didn't stay on television because of black opposition to it, right? The Hollywood branch of the NAACP, so many others, and the curious case of Nicodemus Stewart, who was one of the actors in Amos and Andy, but founded the Ebony Showcase Theater
Mm.
uh, as a training ground for Black actors to demonstrate their range,
Mhm.
and as a corrective to the type
Mhm.
of thing he was engaged
Mhm.
in his day job that gave him the money to be able to put that thing together, right? So living with those contradictions, but making the most out of that, right? Okay, so all that to say, right, before we
Mhm.
even there's already this momentum, right? So that
Mhm.
you begin to see, Black characters, respectable Black characters showing up on episodes of popular shows. Um, by the time there are characters, Ivan Dixon, right, playing characters on in Twilight, at least one Twilight Zone episode.
Mm.
Um, what's the one? At least once on Perry Mason, right? He
Mhm.
does that. Perry Mason in the year 1963, two Black judges, like within a month of each other. I think there are these two Black judges,
Mhm.
um, one of whom
Mhm.
even has lines. I think the
Mhm.
so there, as I can't remember the year
Mhm.
it comes on. The second season of Mannix, the character of Peggy is introduced, Gail Fisher, right? So
Mhm.
that might be 1967.
Mhm.
And either the same year or the year before
Mhm.
that, 66 or 67.
Mhm.
The Julia TV show, right? So Diane
Mhm.
Carroll is Julia, a nurse. But
Mhm.
again, these Black characters that are primarily moving in white spaces, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, you're not getting depictions of any kind of Black community as such.
Mhm.
Um, there might be an episode, right, and that's something that continues through that model, right, and I think you know uh, often you will begin to see stories, and I'm really thinking out over the dang decades, right, of the Black character who might return to the neighborhood, and there's always a kind of tension, between
The story is told, right.
character and
What,
and
yeah,
the person, no, you were right to leave, you get that person, and
absolutely.
um and often that Black character returning is somehow connected to authority, often a cop, right? So in a lot of the
Right.
propaganda, the Black cop,
Right.
has, or the Black I don't know, what do you call them, CSI technician or whatever, right? In the
One
CSI
another kind,
story,
right. Right. Some
right,
affiliation.
right, some affiliation.
Yeah.
And I actually don't ever recall that, and I don't know because I haven't seen every single episode, but I don't ever recall that type of thing with uh, Peggy Fair in the Mannix TV series. Though there was like um, moments with other Black characters or Black characters that needed her support, or but I never recall her and her son, um,
Mhm.
Peggy Fair, a widow, her husband, a an LAPD officer shot in duty, right? So again, the respectability politics is all over
Mhm.
that, right? Same
Yeah.
with Julia. Julia is a widow, right? Widow with a young son, just
Interesting.
like Peggy.
Mhm.
Her Black husband, though, was not a police officer. He was an Air Force Navy pilot, maybe, right? Shot down in
Mhm.
action in Vietnam, I think,
Yeah.
according to the
Mhm.
story. But
Mhm.
again, respectability politics is all over.
Yes.
So there's already,
Yes.
and that's part of the counterinsurgency. So at the same
Mhm.
time, the Black Panther Party is being founded.
Mhm.
At the
Mhm.
same time, that there's already, I think, a revolutionary action movement. Um, right around the time or shortly before um, the Republic of New Africa, would be declared. All this revolutionary fervor and movement, and FBI documents being clear about the popularity of the Panthers and similar groups with Black youth, and that needing to be interrupted, right? And television, becomes a part of that, and you get Black guest stars on shows like The Big Valley, right? Lou Rawls makes a guest
Mhm,
appearance on The Big Rally.
mhm,
Maybe Sammy Davis Jr. does, or maybe that's Bonanza I'm thinking about, or he might have made a guest appearance on all of them. He made at least three guest appearances on the Mod Squad. Um,
mhm,
so that's part of that counterinsurgency, right? That
mhm,
representation. So these
mhm,
are shows that are already green lighted, right? Um, you know, uh, Julia needing to be green lighted, and given the moment in the country, it's a bold move, right? And how long does the show last? One season, maybe two seasons. The Mannix is already a show, right? But so it's in the second season that they bring Peggy in. But this is, well, at least I
mhm,
read it, right, as the industry
mhm.
recognizing
Yes.
and reflecting the
Mhm.
country is changing,
Yes.
the social arrangement is changing,
Mhm,
um, and this is going to
mhm,
be reflected, and that's where the energy is, and there's
mhm,
going to be an audience for it, while there's still an audience for Mayberry, right, for the Andy Griffith Show
mhm,
at
mhm,
7, right?
mhm,
But again, even that show changes. Um,
mhm.
as so I always think it's kind of the mythology of Mayberry, a southern town where there are no black people.
There are no
Right?
black people.
This
Right.
got the
Yeah,
fantasy. Right?
yeah.
But by the time that Andy Griffith has left the show, he's still executive producing, right? But it has shifted into Mayberry RFD. Don Knotts has left the show. He left before Andy Griffith, right? Um,
Mhm,
so it shifts into Mayberry RFD, and now there's a black farmer who becomes not a regular character, but an
mhm,
occasional character, and you
mhm.
have black extras, right? That
So this
you
is
will.
all about, yeah, the management of, um, the management of Blackness in the story
Mhm,
of America, because it's the story of all of these are a story of America, uh, you know, abstracted from Americans, so that
mhm,
none of these things are taking place anyplace else, you know what I'm saying?
mhm,
These are the
mhm,
stories of America, so managing in the different ways that it becomes, crucial, particularly because of the political moment and this groundswell, the groundswell of revolutionary culture, of a revolutionary, let me say, a revolutionary culture, and let's say a groundswell of revolutionary ideology and activity and receptivity to that, for folk who are not necessarily affiliated, like
mhm,
you're talking about, um, what is her name? Hazel Scott. You see, you're talking about Hazel Scott, not necessarily a socialist, not necessarily, but progressive, liberal in socially liberal
mhm,
thinking and what
mhm,
have you, too much for the traffic to bear. So that era of, of that crest wave of radical and revolutionary work, primarily by Black activists. So, right? So it reaches this groundswell, and all communities are impressed by the revolutionary efforts of non-white community. You know what I'm saying? You got middle class white kids right into the South to go and help with registration and participating on the right. So it's all these things. So you have to have a mod squad, right? You have to have what did you say the saying
Right.
is? One black, one white,
Yeah,
one
yeah,
blonde.
that was their language, right? As you know, part of its promotion, right, or at least a part of the pitch. One white, one black, one blonde. Yeah.
So you have right, and this is kind of this minimal kind of a thing there, because you don't have I guess you have an erstwhile Chicano character, brown beret, tip to an erstwhile, well, you have more. I mean, indigenous folk in that kind of time frame, but then
Yeah,
of
a few
course
more
those
stories at the time, right? A few more stories at the
few more
time.
stories
Yeah.
at the time, and a big uh mind container with the Billy Jack series.
Hmm.
Totally comical.
Yeah.
The mythology and the romance of the half breed,
Hmm.
this white presenting half breed, who is trying anyway. But yeah, just insert that to to talk about how these um how the revolutionary and radical sensibilities were further and further diluted in, you know what I mean, in
Hmm.
representing the quote unquote new what liberated culture of their, what I'm saying, then we, move into the safe zones and the ways of eliminating any kind of real political language, and
Hmm.
right, reducing to these kinds of safe areas of representation while maintaining a feel of a
Hmm.
liberated time,
Yeah.
anyway, so
Yeah. Well, one thing is important, that that period, right, and really mid 50s, mid late 50s, through the 70s. There's a breakdown, right? There's a breakdown of the traditional, Hollywood system. The studio system is becoming, that old Hollywood model, that
mm,
really factory model that produced,
mm,
the classic Hollywood films, right?
mhm,
Pre World War II, or pre 1950, films. So it's a moment of rupture, right? So it's a moment where things can break through, and it's kind of prolonged, and so you get the kind of films and television that begin to come out of that period, right? The um, some radical filmmaking, um, and television in particular is a space where more effectively, maybe, those energies can be managed,
mhm,
than in the in the cinema, of the time. But that is important, that the industry itself is undergoing changes. The
mm,
studios did not have the same kind of power that they did before. um,
mhm,
the look of movies began to change.
mhm, mhm,
The style of performance began to change
mhm,
during that
absolutely.
period, and all of that
Mhm,
it's part of what makes it possible. But I think what is leaned into is, in terms of trying to capture and manage that
mhm,
spirit of rebellion,
mhm,
is to lean into the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right?
precisely,
Lean into that, right? Lean into those sorts of
precisely.
areas of, we will not, we're not our parents or whatever, right? You
The
lean into
sexual
that.
revolution, a lot of sexual
Yes,
revolution stories. Yeah. Bob and
exactly,
Ted, and what is it?
exactly.
Bob, Carol, Ted, and Alice, and
Bob,
go
Carol, Ted, and Alice,
ahead.
and yeah,
The
and
rest.
there were, I mean, so many good films from the period. I myself do enjoy a lot of Roger Corman's films from the period. There's one that I, that I think I really like. It's interesting. I watched it not that long ago. I saw it. Oh, it's so different watching it now. A movie called
Mm.
um, The Trip with Peter Fonda. Peter Fonda playing a
Mhm.
psychiatrist, I think, or a psychologist who's experimenting, takes his first acid trip, and it follows his acid, and it's interesting. It's funny. It's very much in its time. It's
Mhm.
rebellious, right? And
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
but a lot, there certainly the films again, what's allowed to become popular and
Yeah.
things do live lives of the underground, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
so things are what's popular where. I mean, that's something. But those a lot of those films, right? They do avoid a, uh, a lot of the political, or they
Mhm.
only deal with it in parody,
Mhm.
in some
Mhm.
fashion,
Mhm.
right? They deal
Mhm.
with it in parody, um, or in some cases, places where they're working out their own racist, histories and ideas. And I often think about that sometimes when I look at some of the work of what's his name, the animator of the period, late 60s, early 70s, and into what I can't remember. He has a version of the Lord of the Rings. Ray Bakshi, right? What is it? Fritz the Cat,
Okay.
Coontown, right? I remember
Mhm.
Coontown being extremely controversial, mid
Mhm.
70s, right? Um, but it too, it's impolite, right? It's underground, um, it's irreverent, and irreverence
There we go.
becomes the stand-in for any kind of
Right.
political. Well, that becomes the
Tactical.
political statement,
Right.
but not in a way that's genuinely anti-capitalist, right? Might be anti-establishment, but it isn't
Right.
really anti-capitalist as such, and it
Right.
certainly isn't. It or yeah, I'm speaking generally. I don't know about
Mhm.
individual filmmakers of the period, but it is,
Mhm.
it's all it doesn't seem to carry the, it isn't third world revolution solidarity, or something like that,
Certainly
or
not telling that story.
not,
Right.
at least again the things that become, are allowed to become popular, or get, find their audience, right? Find their audience of those who want something other than
Right.
the mainstream, fare.
Which is also kind of interesting in terms of how um, part of what contributes to the reduction of of this kind of dynamism is the ways in the way television, right, becomes accessible, right, in
Yeah.
this period. So every
Yes.
home has a TV or two.
Right. Or
Everyone
two.
everyone is watching TV. Everyone
Yes.
is, you know what I'm saying? It becomes
Yeah.
the latchkey solution. It becomes, and beside being latchkey, because I mean that's a kind of a trope. But the thing is, everybody's watching TV because also a trope that is also real. The TV dinner culture,
Mhm.
what have
Mhm.
you. And so inner arts and entertainment, people, the more and more is a home uh contained within the home practice and experience that we all know from personal experience is actually not a social.
Right.
It's not social. It's all, even people sit together and watch the screen, and it has a reflection in the broader culture where people are getting their information about each other and the world from the screen instead of each other, right? So people are
Mhm.
coming into the house, watching television rather than going out for entertainment of various kinds, whether it's live music, whether it's, speakeasy lounge, what have you, these kinds of things, you know what I'm saying? where you're also going to maybe also be more inclined to make other connections and have other kinds of conversations. So anyway, that just struck me
Well, what
as
you do is you have conversations the next day with your coworkers about what you watched on
on
television.
television.
Right. But again, in the
Right.
workplace, you're having the conversations.
Right, in the
What
workplace.
they
But
say,
yeah, I'm talking
the
about
water
how
cooler conversation, right?
this kind right. And so then you get the American iconic couch potato phenomenon,
Mhm,
which is a is a distinct phenomenon and not something that was necessarily, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't
mhm,
a cultural thing before that real embedding of TV watching as the primary form. Monitor, let's call it monitor watching, because that is might even be a better thread through as the primary form of entertainment, you know.
mhm,
And also it becomes um, a class piece as well as televisions become more affordable, um,
mhm,
in the context of how people were working at the time and what the
mhm.
wages were at the time and
It's
all
so
of
that
these.
you could afford 2 televisions or
You can
3.
afford that. It's like every
Mhm.
time we look to go to a concert and be like, "Oh, okay, looks like we're gonna miss that one. We'll be going to the Hollywood Bowl and
Right.
getting the most," because who can go to a concert, you know? So in these times. So
Yeah, it's a yeah, it's a and, you know, live theater just isn't thought of, often, right? It's just, it certainly isn't the entertainment it was, right? I mean, that's, television, the movies,
right.
film and television, right? They
Yeah.
replace vaudeville, right? They replace that type of lowbrow, right? Entertainment, not
Mhm.
because it's the elite, the monies that
Mhm.
are going to the opera,
Mhm. And
uh,
so
and perhaps to the opera, to a classical concert, and perhaps a particular type of play, right? But
mhm. Mhm. My so was to talk about because what we said reaction, reform, and revolution in culture industries. Talk a little bit more about reaction in culture industries.
well, we've been living with it since the 60s, for sure. I mean, in some sense, right? The effect of what's already been mentioned, the Red Scare. I mean, I'm trying to use my language carefully. McCarthyism,
Mm-hmm.
but that period, right? That the anti-communist hysteria, right, of the post-war period, that lasts from the late 40s to 1960, and really beyond, right? The
And
House
beyond.
Un-American Activities is still active in the 60s, but at least in Hollywood, and maybe in the theater world also, um, in the entertainment world, maybe by then, or maybe by the end of the 60s, in the world of education, etc., right? The self-imposed blacklists are broken, right, by that time. So, but I mean, that's a reactionary moment for sure, right? And it's certainly impacting the politics of the work being produced. Um, but I think, yeah, certainly, we've been dealing with reactionary politics. I mean, very direct reactionary politics since the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. There's been reaction, right? Reactionary politics have animated what people begin to think of as conservative politics in the United States, right? Right wing politics, whatever, right? Republican politics. Though we know, in that period, many of the folks who became Republican were Dixiecrats,
Mm-hmm.
but they became Republicans. The
Mm-hmm.
And that is just intensified, right? speaking specifically of the culture industries and television,
Mhm.
that's intensified when, and I'm remembering, I'm going to guess at the date without, because I don't want to get up and look for, an exact date or necessarily look it up. But this, and it does have a name, right? The Rural Massacre or something like that. But the all of these rural based or Western based television shows like the Andy Griffith Show that morphs into Mayberry RFD, shows like Petticoat Junction. What's the other one with the same train in it? Green Acres. The various, the Beverly Hillbillies, though it's
Yes.
set in Los Angeles,
Mhm.
the main characters are from the Appalachians, I guess, right?
Mhm.
The the various westerns, right? Bonanza, Gunsmoke. Although I don't know if Gunsmoke, oh yeah, Guns maybe not the same year, but soon after. So these rurally based, very popular still shows, right? So even though there's this transition happening,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
There is, um, Ironside, right?
Mhm.
Raymond Bird no longer doing Perry Mason, now doing Ironside, and there is a main cast member, a black cast member.
Mhm.
Issues of race are discussed
Mhm. Mhm.
in the show, somehow addressed, right?
Mhm.
The and that and several other shows, right? Again, the Mod Squad um, in 1968, I think. Room 222, right? Liberal teachers in a West Side high school in Los Angeles. Very popular show, lasted a good 5 years. The
Mhm.
So you've got these things, right? You've got this kind of change happening, but these other shows, right, are um, where again there may be the occasional black character by the early 70s, but they're still very popular, but they're canceled,
Mhm.
right? As a new leadership came in, and I'm specifically thinking of CBS shows, right? And I think most of those were on CBS.
Mhm.
Um, some new leadership comes into CBS, and despite the popularity of the shows, it's like we're no longer going to be known as like the rural network,
Mhm.
and then you get these urban based
Mhm.
um, shows
Mhm.
that are also attempting to reflect the social change that's happening, the reform that's happening,
Mhm.
but in again
Mhm.
in such a way that is not going to posit revolution, even
Mhm.
if some of the actors might themselves be
Right.
socialists, right? And
Actually quite radical
survivors of
revolution.
the so-called blacklist.
Mhm.
So shows like Mary Tyler Moore, right,
Mhm.
replace these
Mhm.
shows.
Mhm.
The Carol Burnett show I think was already there, but there's another one. Um,
Yes.
uh, the Newhart, Bob Newhart show, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Um, Good Times that you mentioned, All in the
Yes.
Family,
Yes.
which spins
Maud.
off Maud, which spins off the Jeffersons.
Right.
Maud spins off Good Times, right?
Mhm.
Um, so this, the 71, 72, 73, these shows begin showing up. And of course, ABC and NBC, respond in however they're going to respond, right? We get something like Starsky and Hutch at some particular point, right? And Get Christy Love, right, is in there somewhere, in this time,
Mhm.
and of course, even the tradition of family shows though is still there, but
Mhm.
again, reflecting the change.
Mhm.
So you get the Partridge Family.
So really, as you're describing this, one gets a sense, period to period, one can really feel like kind of the texture of these transitional times where the um, reactionary elements stand next to the reform elements. There is a incidental sprinkling in places of revolutionary and or if not revolutionary, critical, which you haven't totally described yet,
Well, I
but
wouldn't say that at all. No.
oh, okay.
Certainly no incidental sprinkling of anything revolutionary, and actually often a very pointed rejection of anything revolutionary, right?
Mhm.
Reform is the order of the day. And
Mhm.
let's make sure we quash any sort of revolutionary notions, or again,
Mm.
make them parody or,
Well,
unsavory.
I'm thinking of like, the enduring spook who sat by the door. I'm thinking that might be the one. That might be the one, but that becomes something
Okay,
that's
so if you're talking
always
about
to
film, but of course that was snatched out of the theaters right away, and lives this underground life. So yeah,
and
we can talk. I
sprinkle.
mean,
Yeah.
there's an underground, right? I mean, the Battle of Algiers is popular, right? But it's
Mhm.
strictly underground. No, we're
Mhm.
talking about the mainstream, right? And the
Okay, and
mainstream
mainstream
management.
television specifically.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right. And
Mhm.
um, you know,
Mhm.
so yeah, there's accommodation, right? Again, the point I was going to make was
Mhm.
not to leave the Brady Bunch out. Right?
Mhm.
'Cause the Brady Bunch, in its own
Mhm.
way, is trying to reflect that change, right? Um,
Mhm.
I don't think it's so bold that Mike and Carol are divorced. I don't think that's the case. I think that a widow and widower, I believe, right?
Right.
But
Mhm.
it's still a blended family,
Mhm.
and this is new.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a blended family, and that helps set the stage for maybe divorced characters who come later. Um,
Mhm.
so again, an attempt to reflect changes in society while at the same time maintaining, sort of the traditional core, if you will, right? Um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
those revolutionary moments you mentioned,
Mhm.
yeah, are they happening in television? Maybe early Saturday Night Live,
Mhm.
mid
Mhm.
70s, maybe, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, they're probably certain is Roots
Mhm.
revolutionary. I mean, it had an impact for sure,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, whether they intended to or not. Um, but also, the subtitle of the novel, which I believe is the same as the subtitle of the miniseries, An American Saga, right?
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and Alex
Mhm.
Haley certainly wasn't a revolutionary.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
you know,
Right. Right.
but yeah,
The
television, I don't
depiction,
know, right?
certain
But
depictions being a radical kind of breakaway,
yeah,
or I wouldn't want to don't want to use the term radical in a casually. So
yeah,
a remarkable breakaway,
yeah,
uh, significant, yeah,
yes, and
impactful.
and and the result of certain kinds of struggle, right? To
Mhm.
get certain kinds of stories told,
Mhm.
right? But even so, Good Times, right? The Norman Lear oeuvre and Good Times was a struggle, right? It was Esther Roll that
Mm.
insisted that Florida have a husband in the home, and so John Amos gets that role. She insisted that it has to be this way, and never mind if you, who don't know nothing about
Out.
us,
Right.
think it's believable or not.
Right.
This is it. This is
Yeah.
what's going to be, right, and it remained that way, even though
Frozen. I
the
don't know.
character. Now you're frozen for me, but you'll be back in a moment. So I was
Okay.
saying, even though the character of James eventually leaves the show, right?
Mhm.
Florida eventually becomes a widow. There's
Mhm.
another man, right?
Mhm.
Michael has a boss,
Mhm.
um, who then becomes a partner to Florida. I mean, so
Mhm.
that kind. Oh, you're freezing on me again. But I just
Okay.
want to, that sort of internal struggle within the show that was super popular, as you said. Who can say what's going to be popular, and anything that's popular in the United States is certainly going to be more more than popular with Black people, just because we aren't numerical enough, right, to make it widely popular. But at the same
Mm,
time, it was also hugely
mhm,
popular with Black people, which
mhm,
certainly helped the numbers, right? The
mhm,
but there's the curious case of, in terms of what can get through,
mhm,
the curious case of the character of Michael Evans, right? The
mhm,
what Ralph Carter, right? The actor Ralph Carter, who was the militant, right? What was his
mhm.
nickname in the show? Per JJ, the militant midget.
Right. Mhm,
But as the show unfolds over the years, he becomes less so. As
mhm,
he grows up, he becomes less militant.
mhm,
There's even a show, and this might have been in the first season,
mhm,
where Michael, the FBI comes to the apartment because Michael wrote a letter to Fidel Castro wanting to learn about Cuba, right? It's a school assignment.
mhm,
Um, and so, okay, there was a Cuba episode
mhm,
or something like it, right?
mhm,
But
mhm,
and a show that where lots of
mm,
social issues were able to get addressed in particular ways, right?
mhm,
So some politics that might be more than reform were able to sneak through, and I do think that can happen. Even
mhm,
that because one thing we know, whatever directors may intend, whatever writers may intend, whatever the actors may intend, whatever the programmers and producers may intend. You cannot anticipate how every audience member is going to respond and interpret.
mhm,
And there's always somebody out there who can, do oppositional readings, right, or just unique
mhm,
readings of what they see. Um,
mhm,
and so things get through even when they don't mean them to.
mhm, mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. Um, and so I think of the, um, uh,
Wait a minute.
surge.
Wait a minute. Let me ask you a question.
Uh-huh.
Think about when you think about Good Times
Yes,
and the Evans family
yes,
living on Cabrini Green projects in
yes,
Chicago.
yes.
What's the most opposite Black television family you can think of?
Oh, the Huxtables.
Exactly. And that was
Yes,
the move, right? From the 70s to
yes.
the 80s.
Which is exactly where I was actually about to go, the '80s, right?
Mhm.
And, in terms of where I was talking yesterday about the kind or not yesterday, listen to me, yesterday. I meant earlier in this, program, but I actually think I meant when we were talking pre-program. But
Mhm.
talking about the different periods, right, that are made in the false memory, right, of the American
Mhm.
imagination that television has consolidated, right? So we've got, the Western scape, the
Mhm. Yeah.
so which is often the prairie scape, and the you know
Mhm.
what I mean. We have we talked about the uh, early suburbia scape, the
Mhm.
middle class, this new, you
Mhm.
know, the vigorous white middle class, where we have that nuclear family established, and the not, wealthy, not particularly well-to-do, but
Solidly
employed,
middle class, though.
solidly middle class, right? The mother at home doing cookies and church groups and whatever else it is she's doing, and the father is out, so all of the gender roles, the this, that, and the other, all those kinds of things. And you what struck me as I was thinking about it was, yeah, it's quite a middle class world. It's not too often, and there's something very specific happening if you go into an upper class world, right? But the 80s, with the 80s, we have what the kind of focus on the super wealthy, with the shows like the spate of shows like Dynasty and Dallas, and there was a host of them that I don't
Dallas, which
recall the
gets started
names of.
in the late 70s,
In the and that talking
the
about that
transition
early
period.
transfer, talking about
Mhm.
that early those early
Mhm.
80s, right?
Mhm.
So And again, this scape of wealth, and
Mhm.
and
Lifestyles of the
in
rich and
store
famous, one of
lifestyles
the
of the rich and famous,
first
and he's
reality TV
chosen.
shows.
Say that again.
One of the first reality TV
TV
shows,
shows,
Lifestyles
lifestyles
of
of the
the
rich and famous,
famous.
right? Um, and one is hard pressed to see the lives of uh well, no, when do you ever when have you ever, outside of good times, outside,
No, you
see the
don't.
lives of working class or barely working class people or impoverished people. You
Yeah,
don't see the livescapes of those folks.
you
And
don't.
80s on, anytime you're watching something, people are actually wealthy in terms of the characters in the story, for whom there is there's no financial, or let's say
Mhm, mhm,
material support
mhm,
issue that ever enters into the
mhm.
storyline, because
Depending
that's
on
what.
depending on the scope, right? Because
Say that
as
again.
you were talking about, it depends on which sort of landscape it is, right? Because where you do see that character is in the cop shows,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
In
Now
the cop
say
shows,
that.
right?
Yes,
Because it's
say
a
that.
problem that's got to
Yes.
be dealt with. Yeah.
As a problem that has to be dealt with. So you go into the urban scape, the urbosphere, the the which is the same sphere, absolutely. But that's also really important because of that, of the okay, in programs like cops and the emergence of not the emergence of, but some of those let's say the propaganda era of the, what was it, mid 80s. When did Law and Order start as a
I don't know when Law and Order started.
set
I
of
know
series?
Cops was on television in the mid 80s.
Mid 80s to the
Cops, yeah.
90s.
Bad Boys, What You Gonna Do?
Do what you're gonna
That
do.
started in the 80s, maybe as
Yes,
early as 86.
yes.
Cops started.
Because it's always been a cop culture, a Law and Order culture, a cops and courts culture.
Law
Um,
and Order, I'm not sure, but the 90s, right? And there was another
yeah.
one that was not Law and Order, that but was
Yes.
similar and gritty, um, uh, set in Baltimore, and Yaphet Kotto was in it. I can't
Yeah.
remember what it was.
Neither
Um,
can I, but there's so many of them.
but that's just it. They proliferate.
NYPD Blue, Cagney and Lacey.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
All that's that. Again, another one that was extremely popular in the 1980s, propaganda now, and so really, there's this weird juxtaposition. Two of the most popular cop shows, one presented itself right as super gritty
Mhm.
and realistic, and maybe
Mhm.
was realistic in the sense that often they didn't follow procedure.
Mhm.
And the other one that was really flashy, where they actually always followed procedure. So the flashy Miami Vice and the gritty what is it, Hill Street Blues, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And both of them uh, were critical, right?
Mhm.
Propaganda pieces
Mhm.
um, in terms of uh, criminalizing any kind of notions of rebellion,
Yeah.
resistance, black resistance,
Yeah.
the as sites of, well, on Hill Street Blues, right? A site where the cops worked out their racial animosities with each
Mhm.
other.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and Hill
Mhm.
Street Blues, where all of that, everybody was just, tight and buddies, kind of like the Mod Squad group, because it wasn't just Crockett and Tubbs, right? It was also
Mhm.
the station with I forget his character's name, but Edward James Olmos as the captain,
Yes.
um, and then the two women, one I think she was supposed to be Cuban American, and then one sister, who were also on the squad, and then
Mhm.
the two sort
Mhm.
of, I don't want to say dumpy, uh, more casually dressed white guys, right, that were on the squad. One of them was probably Jewish, if they
Okay.
were following the
Right,
usual
right,
model. I'm just
right,
guessing though, right?
right.
Because I don't know, I
And
can't ever
what a
remember.
departure, say, between
Huh?
that, just hopping back, a departure, that kind of what squad room drama,
Mm-hmm.
uh, in comparison to the was it was it Miller? Somebody, Barney Miller,
Mm-hmm.
as as
Comedy.
a comedy
Yeah.
presentation of the squad room with a very definite and different politic from that day. But
Yeah.
anyway, that
Well,
just made me
again,
think
Barney
about
Miller is the 70s, right?
where absolutely,
It's the
absolutely.
70s.
So
And
from that day, yes. So
responding, although I think Barney Miller might be one of the shows that made it to like 1980, 81, something like that.
before it went
As
off.
that change is happening, again, as reaction um,
Yes, yes,
asserts itself, right? One of the
yes.
first successful assertions of the reaction since the mid 60s. Um,
Mhm,
the
mhm,
In a particular way, right? The
mhm.
And I think that's important thing to always to remember too about Good Times. Its trajectory, follows the um, quote unquote American dream, or the again, all of these television shows.
Yes.
Last week we talked about the ego ideal, and they are absolute representations of America's ego ideal, nuanced by whatever the politics of the
Yes.
program makers might be. But
Mhm,
anyway, by the end of it, um, they have reached middle class happiness.
mhm,
They're going to move out of the project.
mhm.
Um,
Middle class heaven. Go ahead.
the
Mhm,
Thelma and her husband are, well, he has a chance to make the Chicago Bears football
mhm,
team, NFL football team, right?
mhm.
They're promised, a at least some seed money if he can have a 3-year career of solid middle class entry. Plus, she's a college student. Michael is off to college. Um, they are now going to get a house now that Keith is going to be playing, or at least is likely going to be playing for the Chicago Bears. They
Mhm,
have found a new place. They're still renting, right? But they have
mhm,
found a new place in the suburbs somewhere. So they're going to move in there, and they're bringing Florida with them.
hmm,
Because
mhm,
after all, Michael is getting ready to go off to college.
mhm,
Um, JJ
mhm,
has, for about a year or so, turned
mhm,
his art skills
mhm,
into an advertising agency. So he's doing
mhm,
commercial art, right? So
mhm,
um,
hmm,
he's a business owner, an
mhm.
executive, even, right? And has dressing in suits, and again moving into middle. I can't remember where he's going. He's not staying in the apartment, as I recall. The
Mhm,
And it just turns out that Walona, and of course Penny, right, who Walona has adopted.
mhm,
Walona's also gotten a promotion, right? So she's
mhm,
going to be making better money. I think she might be becoming like a manager, or head man, something, or maybe a buyer, something. She's
mhm,
gotten, but they're going to have to move.
mhm,
But they're going to have to move to the suburbs. Turns
mhm,
out they're moving to the suburbs
mhm.
where, Florida and Keith and Thelma are living, and the place turns out to be a duplex. So they can just move in. But the point is, everybody's moving to the suburbs
Right,
and joining the middle class.
right.
solidly joining the middle class,
Yes.
leaving the Black working poor
Yes.
behind to
Yes.
whatever happens to them
Yes.
in Greeny Green.
Yes. Yes.
And that ends up being, that's the trajectory of the
Yes.
story,
Yes.
of the arc of the series. And so whatever potential it had was already muted in season one with the promotion, again talking about that curation, with the promotion of JJ, right, the character
Mhm.
JJ,
Mhm.
and the ready, the ready for marketing um, catchphrase, right, dynamite.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the show, funny as it is,
Mhm.
poignant as it is, and able to really spend several years sharing the plight of the poor in this country, the Black poor in particular, but
Mhm.
the poor in this country, what
Mhm.
seniors face, problems of child abuse, lack
Yes.
of adequate medical care,
Yes.
overworked doctors,
Yes.
racist IQ to all of the stuff,
All
right,
of
that
the
it's able
things.
to do, that fits well within reform,
Yes.
as long as you ain't offering no radical solutions to these
Solutions.
things, right?
Right. So
Um,
yes, the importance of the pathology. Well, these are good people, and Florida's devout, the Florida
mhm,
character, devout uh, uh, aspect um, is a character, in the story, right? Is a
mhm,
impactful element in the story, but just as we, carry the conversation to the next piece, being sure to talk about that the endlessly pathological poor, right?
right,
Right.
exactly,
Endlessly pathological poor.
and it, yeah,
Um, and the importance of maintaining that and presenting that, um,
mhm,
and the the what the promotion of pathology in and of itself. Um, and I cut you off. Excuse me if you remember what
okay,
it was you were saying.
I think I said it.
You said it? Okay, good,
It's,
because I felt like I was, like,
um,
jumping
I mean,
in.
as you're, I mean, as you're talking, that's, I thought of another show, late 70s, and then came back in the 80s, I think. What's
Mhm.
Happening
Mhm.
in our own
Mhm.
Los Angeles, where again, but
Mhm.
really just to say that the model is again, right, that
Mhm.
family, which seemed quite recognizable, to me,
Mhm.
um, also appeared to be pretty fairly middle class, never, or
Yeah.
at least, working class, but not worried about too many
Yeah, they
financial
were.
things.
Yeah. Right. Right.
As I mean, I don't recall what Mama did for a living, right? Or Mabel King played the character.
Right, but
Um,
they weren't out of they
no,
weren't reduced in need.
right.
They weren't reduced
They
by
weren't reduced in need, right?
their life wasn't a
Raj
daily
and Dee
struggle.
might have had to earn their own little pocket money,
Yeah,
right? But right, exactly. They weren't scuffling, and they weren't in the projects.
that's what I was gonna say, they weren't shuffling and surviving.
Yeah, right. They weren't shuffling and surviving.
You weren't
Right.
shuffling and
Yeah,
surviving.
that's
I
right.
wonder who wrote that. No, it's a good
That's
song.
interesting. And
Yeah.
well, bringing that up, a very different kind of theme music, also, right? That little bouncy theme
Yes,
music that they had.
yes,
Mhm.
yes. Yeah, um, in comparison to the really, really rich, that the Good
Mhm.
Times theme
Mhm.
song is really a jam.
Mhm. With
Great
Janet Du
song.
Bois, Janet Dubois
Yes,
singing, and
yes.
I forget who the writer is, right? But yeah, there's some things
Yeah,
going on there. Yeah.
it's a great song. Um, so this is what has been on my mind and why I was thinking about pathology, because I've watched I'm sure I've missed a few, but only a few. Every episode of Law and Order SVU that has been produced. I'm sure I have, right? So I've seen the evolution of stuff over the years and the politics of different writers filtering through
Mhm.
and the way the this anyway, it's a whole world, right? And
Mhm.
so looking at how, um, particularly in that Law and Order series, because that was my, where I sat. I think I watched some Criminal Intent. I liked was it D'Onofrio? Like that actor.
Mhm.
Um, but the way that that particular brand of propaganda storytelling is like this, the way it subsumes all the politics and responds to all of the politics in the context of pulling stuff out of the headlines to the, what I'm saying? So it is
Mhm.
absolutely propagandistic in its intent and in its, very conservative, very right wing, with a nod to, nods to certain liberal conventions,
Mhm.
the way the characters are painted, right? Um, just as general context, but when issues are dealt with, uh, like the immigration raids, the first round of immigration raids. It was a show, and they dealt with the topic and had to address the unfairness and the impropriety of it. But when you deal with a better example, for some reason they like to deal with the IRA. They've had several villains that are IRA associated,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I
Um,
think partly
it
because of where the show is located, right on the.
okay, okay,
And I
uh,
actually don't think that the country broadly realizes how many Irish immigrants there are, right?
uh-huh,
In
uh-huh,
and the other Irish presence in New York,
okay,
Boston.
okay.
So that's
Fair.
interesting. Yeah, that
Well, that's fair because Cagney and
there's a
Lacey
regional
was also
logic to it.
yeah, I think Cagney and Lacey, I remember it takes place, but it was definitely East Coast.
Mhm.
Um, may have been New York, may have been Boston, I don't remember. But, um, the the I'm thinking in particular, right? They're dealing with, right, the whole criminalization and or discrediting of environmental activists. When
Mhm.
these people were chaining themselves to whatever they needed to change themselves to, when those demonstrations are gritty, right? And drawing people's attention and drawing public approval and drawing, you know what I'm saying? And drawing attention that, right? So the way SVU has dealt with that, right? There's the line, the trope, the script that says, that deals with a pathology, pathologizes the activist, right? These are insecure people or people who are fundamentally unstable and driven to extremes. You know what I'm saying? And of course, the
Right.
non-activist you know what I'm saying? Totally removed police officer characters are supposed to have some kind of uh, uh, higher wisdom of how to approach these things. Just
Mhm.
this is not how you do that. This is not how you handle that. Dealing with, of course, had a lot of um, BLM where the public is instructed that, the civil rights attorneys are opportunists, they're showmen, all these kinds of things. But
Mhm.
that kind of caught my interest, in terms of showing activists in this case, in these times when there's like a lot of popular psychology and a lot of tropes about, psychology and uh different aspects of psychology, um, that now the activist becomes an unstable person, someone who is emotionally
Yeah.
unstable, disturbed, to the point of being suicidal and desperate to
Mhm.
show these kinds of
Mhm.
things. But the way, yes, propaganda um, becomes, and I can't really speak to the Hill Street Blues, the other kinds of squad room dramas and that kind of thing, but that Law and Order series had a way of or created a whole universe, of political commentary, you know.
It's in
Um,
keeping with all of them. I mean, it's in the tradition. I mean, just simply put, it is in the tradition of
mhm, mhm,
doing everything you just said, right? Somehow
mhm,
pathologizing or making an object of ridicule, right? The activist, particularly any kind of activism that is radical in some kind of way, or that is
mhm,
more than just a peaceful demonstration.
mhm,
Um, so it's in the tradition, right? And you mentioned Hill Street Blues. There's one particular episode where there's Yaphet Kotto plays the character, and he's something like the leader of some
mhm,
black militant organization that is somehow or some way holding a building hostage or something like that. Um, blasting out political screed on some into the neighborhood, and the good liberal
mm,
hostage negotiator who's earnestly
mhm,
trying to get him to understand,
mhm,
because he's really trying to save his life
mhm,
also.
mhm,
So yeah, there's a long trope of it, and or that other thing you said, right? The idea of the opportunist,
mhm,
um, uh, you know the the opportunist black politician,
mhm,
featured in Good Times, recurring character in Good Times, right? I
mhm,
think that character, or not that character, but that trope showed up a couple of times in what's the
mhm.
TV show, Sanford and Son,
Yes,
or the militant who's really a
yes,
huckster, right? And
right.
a very particular episode of That's My Mama.
Oh, that's my mama.
That's My
Yes.
Mama, right?
Mhm,
Where a former black militant has
mhm,
decided to run for city council or something like that, right?
mhm,
And Mama is not having it, right? Because she's not going to get behind any old black militants, who, anybody that was to the left of Dr. King, though not really, because we're not thinking about the real Dr.
to
King,
King, right.
but
We're talking about this false memory.
the
Yeah.
false memory of Dr. King. And
Mhm,
so she's adamant, right, that no, this guy, there's nobody to support, right? And so he has to come to a dinner where she has invited the minister and what ends up being, various members of the black bourgeoisie, right, or the respectable blacks, all of whom are like, oh no, this guy, no way. And it's just so clear a rejection of the black militant, and this character it has to demonstrate that he has left all that behind him. And then a couple of
mm,
black militants come in wearing their berets and their shades and their like army fatigue jacket, talking hip,
right.
um, that he
So
has to send
right.
away. I'm not down with that anymore, blah, 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 right? And then,
Yeah,
of course, later it's discovered that they're actually actors that he hired so that he could demonstrate that he left that all behind because they were all about to make some money, right? So
I see.
this is
Uh,
that's my mama. I mean, this is the message, and
yeah.
the stolid black middle class, who had the wisdom to see through him, even
Right.
in the days when he was a militant, right? It's
Right.
just, it is frankly disgusting.
Frankly.
It
Yeah.
is, the
And
episode is disgusting, but it's just part of the
yeah.
message that gets repeated often. And if we go through shows of the
Right.
70s into the 80s, right? Um, uh, 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 what is it? The White Shadow had a similar type storyline where a brother wrongly incarcerated, right, comes out angry at the system, but don't be poisoned by his anger, right?
Right.
He needs to deal with his anger and just
Right.
come around to things are better,
Right.
all this, the trope over and over again, right?
Absolutely.
The
And
shooting in a black neighborhood, and everybody's angry at the cops and getting ready to riot.
absolutely.
Give us a chance to investigate, and it turns out
Yeah.
it was another black guy,
Right.
or an
Right.
accident, and
Or yes, right. That not only an accident, but an accident that the uh, uh, offending law enforcement representative is just eaten up over, just heartbroken,
just
just oh
eat.
my
Yes, thank
god,
you.
terrible.
So
I killed a
broken.
kid. I
I killed a kid. Yes,
can't believe it.
yes.
You know.
How many
And how
of
many
these
times
cop
have you seen it
shows?
represented? So, this is also going back to the um the saga of the black activist in this false memory, in this, right, in this generated American story, um that it's also modeling, right? This is how also, right, in terms of the respectability, and the eventual Huxtableization
Mhm.
of black representation, you know. Um
I would say we
and
haven't recovered from that. The
no,
Huxtabilization.
yeah, no,
Yeah, we have
because
not.
and it of course it draws on all our internal conflicts and struggles with these issues of assimilation and identity and respectability, and all of those things figure into it. But yeah, doesn't have to figure in it into it so strongly as as your Pasla excavation very very much brings to the foreground, looking at the publications, looking at the footage of old programs that were on television, that were on, in the that folks are happily consuming, happily watching. As you just pointed out, there's not enough black people in America to be solely responsible for a a network, a big network success. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? So this whole question of what people, what certain what this projection and this reinforcement of some kind of the reality or naturalizing of the segregated community. So this group of people doesn't want to know about that group of people and doesn't want to about really, what I'm saying? People enjoy good stories, and so again, this place where there can actually be a collectivizing impact and effect, but the curation um, pushes toward those things that uh, uh, serve the controlling elite, serve the
Mhm.
the serve to maintain the power relations
Mhm.
and all of that. Um, and you don't see how many stories do you see? I think Roseanne, and you can tell me. I think Roseanne is the only one that I can remember, but I haven't watched everything. I
Where
certainly
you
haven't
have like an actual working class family as the
working
central,
class
right?
white people,
Yeah.
you know? So
There was now it's interesting you say white people.
or
So
white people. Yeah, go
this
ahead.
is there ethnic, right? A little ethnicity helps, right? Because there was a 1950s the Goldbergs, or was it the Goldsteins, or something like
Okay.
that, which was a working class Jewish family, right? Somewhere,
Uh-huh.
and a comedy.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how long it was on air, right?
Uh-huh.
But it was rare, right? That was rare.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then the very popular The Honeymooners, right? Working
Mm-hmm.
class.
Mm-hmm.
A bus driver and his stay-at-home wife,
Mm-hmm.
and a sewer worker, right? A sanitation
Mm-hmm.
worker
Right.
and his stay-at-home wife, but solidly working class. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but so that's two we can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
there are probably some more if we try hard enough. I mean, it depends on, again, a show like the Andy Griffith Show, right? I mean, there are
Mm-hmm.
working class characters, right?
Right.
There
Mm-hmm.
are some hard scrabble rural characters. But again,
Right.
all of these things tend to
Right.
be couched in comedy,
Exactly.
in comedy,
Exactly. Exactly.
um, right?
Yeah.
Now, to a certain extent, I no one would. I don't think few people would think of it this way. And I understand why, because they don't think of the artist in that way. But to in a certain way, um, the Ricardos are a working class family, um, and the Mertzes
Mm-hmm.
from I Love Lucy. Now the Mertzes own the building; they're
Right.
landlords,
Right.
but this is money that they have saved from their career in vaudeville, right, as
Mm-hmm.
performers.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
Ricky's a working,
Right.
musician and singer.
Musician. Right.
Um, we don't think we've been again. We have been, we the United States generally, right, has been socialized or trained to not see artists
Right.
as workers,
Right.
to not see teachers as workers,
Mm-hmm.
right, to not see
Mm-hmm.
doctors as workers
Right. Mm-hmm.
because of certain levels of education, maybe payment,
Mm-hmm.
not having calluses,
What is a
right,
worker? Yeah.
right, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, are
Right.
also wearing their bodies down, right, through
Yes.
the intense work,
Mm-hmm.
and the way in which their work, our work, is exploited, and a site
Mm-hmm.
of extraction, right, a site of
Mm-hmm.
extraction for profit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Even in so far as preparing, the next generations of workers, right?
Yes.
The
And by do so doing, by localizing and containing the image and the definition of worker, one is able to abstract and talk about labor
right,
relations, labor and and capital, and begin to think about, well, if there's a worker who is also the owner and all these kinds of things. Go ahead.
right, right. Well,
Mm.
I'm looking at the clock,
Oh
um,
yes, we are there.
and I'm also thinking that we've covered, reaction, reform, and revolution, but we
Mm-hmm.
clearly haven't exhausted the conversation,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because there's a whole, we got some decades to cover if we want. And we haven't even talked about the music industry as one of these culture industries,
Mm-hmm.
which has been so critical and such an important site of colonial extraction.
Mm-hmm.
The Which is something I always want us to be thinking about, right? What we were just talking about, the way in which the arts are there already a site of labor extraction, commodity, extraction, um, profit,
Yes. Yes.
um, but also the way in which colonized communities, right, the internal colonies of the United States, continue to be sources of extraction, right? That extractive element of the colonial relationship. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm thinking about that as we move into the 90s and that other
Mhm.
rich black family
Mhm.
that has
Mhm.
currently been revisited, right?
Mhm.
The Bankses and the Prince of Bel Air,
Mhm.
um, and
All of the
and
rich black
all the
families,
rich
yeah,
black folks. Yes,
and rich
uh,
black people, super
and
wealthy black people.
yes, and once again, um, adjusted in white society in some way,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Um,
yes.
in some particular way. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
so that we can, so I guess I'm
Yeah.
recommending we pick up with the conversation next week, and no need
Yes.
to change the title,
No
um,
need to change the title. We're
because
gonna
all of this
continue.
is
Yeah,
about
these things.
managing the energies,
Managing the ear energies, and we'll
manage.
probably be able to get to also in next week's conversation because we definitely want to localize it to this time, right? And the uh what the for the attack on culture industries, the attempt to contain and control the a very education industries or whatnot, but as in arts and cultures, as you start off mentioning about the foreign movie tariffs and the taking over of the Kennedy Center and the, you know what I'm saying, and all of these kinds of what we can anticipate and kind of talk about what happens to cultural expression um, in authoritarianism. What happens to it and why? How does it? There's a lot to dig into
There's a lot
uh,
to dig
with
into. I
that.
mean, because that's an interesting what does happen to it, and what's happened that's going to make it so different, actually, because everything we've been talking about is how all of this reform has been to counter revolution.
Mhm.
So how is that
Well, a
different from
difference well,
reaction?
then we're talking about a different phase 'cause, again,
Yeah,
we're always talking about, yeah, there is a difference in this context. And in this particular context, yeah, it's always taking us back to the status quo. But in this particular context, what might be anticipated. For instance, your comment, I think we're about to hear a lot more country music. We're about to see a lot more biblical films. And indeed, we are.
yeah.
Indeed we are. Netflix has, when you look at the streaming services, there are a lot of Bible stories, the book of this, the book of that, and all of that sort of thing as that expands. I think part of the question becomes how that very specific particular brand of storytelling expands the particular story that is, wanting to be reasserted and wanting to be told, um, or that they intend to reassert and
Well, that's
tell.
what I think is interesting, because again, the whole point of the reformist content has been to counter revolution, and that's still too much for the reactionaries. And so,
Mm, mm,
um, yeah,
mhm,
uh, but there will always continue to be, as there is, um, an underground, right, and an alternative, um, that finds its audience, um, and that they're
yes.
always seeking,
Mhm,
they being the various industries,
mhm,
um, to figure out what's the next new thing and how can
mhm.
we co-opt it.
To extract and yes, and
Mhm,
control. Mhm, and
mhm.
contain.
So yes, let's do
Okay.
that. Let's do that. So uh, thank you, thank you for watching. If you watch this later, thank you again. Leave us comments. I saw that our we had quite a few views of the conversation last week. I actually didn't check to see if there were comments, but I did just see that there were views. So anyway, we want to remind you to subscribe to our channel if you're on YouTube. Like this video and please share it. We are now at 2+ hours, so we're gonna say good night.
And good night.
Good night, y'all. Power to the people, all the people, everywhere.